Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Singer. I'm the Adult Programs and Outreach Coordinator for the Kellogg-Hubbard Library. Welcome tonight for Visual Criminology, Images, Debates, and Justice Policy. We're happy to have you with us tonight. I see most of you all of you are on mute. That's wonderful. That's how we're going to keep it while our speaker is giving his presentation. We are taking questions in the chat. So feel free to put your question in the chat. We can address some of them during the presentation, and we can also wait till the end where there'll be a Q&A where we can ask questions and have a discussion. We are recording this program, so if you know someone who couldn't be here, or if you would like to revisit this program, you're welcome to go to the Adult Programs page of the Kellogg-Hubbard Library website or our YouTube channel. You just search under Kellogg-Hubbard Library. I think that's all of our housekeeping. We're glad to have you here. Our speaker tonight is Johannes Wheeldon. He's the Executive Director of SPEAK, an organization dedicated to expanding debate and dialogue. He has more than 20 years of experience working in criminal justice, including teaching in prisons, working with those deemed high risk to reoffend, and designing, conducting, and managing justice reform projects around the world. He has published 5 books and is an adjunct professor at Norwich University. We're very happy to have him with us tonight. Johannes, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for being interested and coming along. And I'm excited to share some of this work and to engage with you all. As Michelle said, the questions will go through the chat. And so if something occurs to you as I'm going through, please feel free to log a question, and I'll try to answer as we go. So the first thing I want to sort of say is how delighted I am to be here. We are big users of the Kellogg-Hubbard Library. Our kids are there every week, and so it's delightful to be able to be part of the library's adult education and outreach program. And yeah, I just want to thank the library for hosting this and allowing the opportunity to share this work. I want to thank Michelle for organizing and staying on top of all the bits and pieces. And I want to acknowledge Rachel Weichel, who had the idea to share this work in this way. So thanks to all of you. So nominally, this presentation is about this book. And there is a copy at the library if anyone who's interested in Montpelier in looking at the hard copy. The book is really my effort to wrestle with the question of what is visual criminology and how we should understand it and what the value is to the discipline in general. And 14 contributors wrote chapters as part of this book and examined a wide variety of issues and topics within criminology, everything from history to understanding the eras of criminal justice policy, policing, victims work, criminological theory, data collection, and a variety of other topics. One issue that we focus on is the question of translational criminology. And this is the perennial question of how it is that academics can ensure that their research is in the hands of people who are able to do something with it in terms of policy. And I want to talk a little bit about that at the end of the talk, but I just want to flag it now. The book also includes research I conducted with visual scholars, mostly in Canada and the US, although there were a few from the UK that participated as well. And really, I wanted to understand their take on what I was trying to do within visual criminology. And some of it was positive and some of it was dubious, I think. But ultimately, it sort of started a conversation about how we should understand visual criminology and specifically the use of visuals within criminology. And that sets up, in some ways, a debate that I want to share with you and get your take on. So that's a little bit of a background. Tonight, I want to provide a provisional definition. And I really want to focus on images from the book, images from other places. And I want to focus on how they tell stories, how they present information, how they subvert or challenge understanding, and how they represent knowledge. Then I want to share with you some debates around visual criminology and talk about the potential and at least some of the problems before the Q&A session. And again, if as I go through these images, something occurs to you, please feel free to make a note of that in the chat so we can come back to it. So the curse of the academic is that they must define everything before they discuss it. So let's start here. The use of any image, including but not limited to paintings, photographs, drawings, maps, diagrams, graphs, charts, and other visual and graphic approaches in criminology to collect information from participants, describe, present, and analyze data, and or examine or interrogate the meanings of those data. So maybe some of you are thinking, well, what isn't visual criminology with such a broad definition? And that's a challenge that we're going to come back to. But ultimately, my work with Danielle Harris, who's a professor in Australia, and I'll be sharing some of her work as part of this talk, we decided that it was important to try to capture as many different aspects, because visual criminology as traditionally construed is quite limited and quite specific in what it means. So the first principle is that pictures tell stories, and this will surprise none of you. Within criminology, it's particularly interesting. So understanding crime, understanding breaking and straining the fabric of society and what we choose to do and live together and how we respond to that is, of course, as old as people choosing to live together in some form of community or society. So too is the depiction of what this means. And from Cézanne to other work, this stuff matters. But for criminology, the visual really starts with Lombojo, who was an Italian criminologist, who was fascinated by the shapes of people's faces. And he is considered sort of really important in criminology because he ushers in a new scientific age. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we'd say it's pseudoscience. Lombojo would go to insane asylums and prisons, and he would measure folks who were in there, their heads and the shapes of their foreheads and the distance between their nose and their ear and how different parts of their head were shaped and the interrelationships between them. And he concluded that people that had certain features were criminal. Obviously, there's lots of problems there, but one problem for criminology and this sort of biological process and program was the racial implications, because perhaps unsurprisingly, the science of crime helped establish or appeared to establish the idea that folks that looked a certain way were more destined to be criminal. Biological criminology doesn't consider whether the laws themselves are just, doesn't consider how people are policed, doesn't consider the consequences of systemic notions within society about whose ideas matter and why. I included this, I came across it from a woman who writes a blog, really actually interested in costume design, but had included this because of the image from behind it. And I became fascinated with the idea that this appeared in a newspaper and trying to figure out why exactly it appeared. The title seems, the tone of it, I can't quite figure out if it's serious or not. But part of me, as I look at this image, has to ask why it is they needed a weapon. I will note that if you look just below mops and above flat irons, you will see revolvers as weapons. But it's fascinating to think of the way that media at this era was talking about women in crime and how they were presenting it. This is an image that is a feature of every criminological theory textbook that exists. It comes from the Chicago School. And the Chicago School of Criminology really, in many ways, set out a research program focused on a variety of elements. But the one that this image is focused on is the idea that crime has a relationship to geography. And you see here the central business district in the middle and the transitional zone, as opposed to the outside where you see where people lived. And Park, Burgess, and McKenzie in 1925 posited that most of the crime happened in the transitional zones where people didn't live. And they talk about deteriorated housing and abandoned buildings. And the idea here is that, and it's one that persists today, where there is physical disorder, there is also social disorder. But again, this image is old and longstanding. This is the first, in my quest as part of the research for the book, I was really looking for examples of visual criminology that were unusual and that were older. And this is a crime scene watercolor of a particularly heinous crime that occurred near Brisbane, Australia. And you see the car there, and you see the markings describing elements of the crime where the body was found. But I just thought it was so fascinating. And in the book, I talk about, the sort of the soft colors and lines of the picture, which are in some ways telling the story of this horrible crime. And the juxtaposition fascinates me. But the idea that when trying to understand crimes, people would try to visualize it, and using whatever technology or tools that were at hand, in this case, watercolor. This is one of my favorite statues from a very sad and special place, Solitude Pills, Latvia. I did a lot of work in criminal justice reform in Eastern Europe, and I lived in Latvia for a number of years. Solitude Pills is a Holocaust memorial, but it's also a series of incredible statues. And I included this because it speaks to this other tactile visual connection that sculpture suggests. But this idea of the mother trying to protect her children from the horrors that were to come. Solitude Pills was a sort of a way station between the concentration camps to the east, and it's an incredibly somber, sad place. The gate as you walk in says, "Beyond this gate, the earth moans." And I think when we're thinking about visual criminology, we owe it to ourselves to think big. So those are some historical examples of visual elements within criminology. But the most common visual examples in criminology would not be considered visual criminology at all. And this always bothered me. Particularly because presenting data visually has always been a part of academia, has always been part of criminology. So whether we're talking about graphs or charts or box and whisker plots or pie charts that we're also familiar with, the visual presentation of data has always been part of visual criminology. And yet for some, it shouldn't be considered as such. And we can talk about why. But I want to give you a few examples. So this is a relatively new phenomenon where we see people who are creating these charts to explain how it is they selected studies for their review. So you see there the Medline search, where they're looking for key terms related to incarceration and reoffending, and then places. And then basically what this shows you is the process the researchers took to go through to select studies from the 366 that they initially identified, to the others that they decided to exclude and include. And this idea is part of justification, increasingly important in science. But this visual element of how they did it is a relatively new and interesting phenomenon. This sort of chart shouldn't be a surprise to many of us. We have been seeing these maps mostly in the context of COVID cases, and most of us realize that red is not good. This particular chart is around race and assault-related arrest rates. And it comes from a paper back in 2015. But what's valuable about it is the way that you overlay geography with incidence, with intensity, and how you are able to get at that visually rather than through a chart or a table. This is another example from my friend Nahani Pollard's work in Vancouver. And this is a map of the downtown. You see Stanley Park, the top near the left, and then the downtown east side, where you see a number on East Hastings. To the right, bottom right of the photograph, you see a number of incidences. And so this is another way to visualize the connection between geography and crime. This is yet another one, and my partner was very skeptical about me including this particular one because she says it doesn't mean anything. Well, what does it even mean? And I agree that it's not necessarily easy to untangle, but what's interesting about it is the way that they are trying to show connections between different issues, whether it's the prevalence of mental illness or gun laws and mass killings with firearms, with the intensity. And so it's trying to get at two things here. What's the nature of the relationship? Is it positive or negative? How strong is the relationship? With red being very negative and dark blue being very positive. This is the kind of thing I think we're going to see more of in criminology. I have some opinions about how it can be better organized, but for our purposes, I think this gives you a general sense of what we're trying to do with those images. I came across this actually as part of a different project, but I couldn't take my eye away from it. This is visualizing the connections within the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. And the purpose of the paper was to compare online discussion with what was being reported in mainstream outlets like the New York Times. And basically, the broad text that was being reported in mainstream publications was not capturing a whole host of preposterous notions. For those of you who don't know, the Pizzagate conspiracy related to a theory about the harm of children that was happening in the basement of a business called Comet Ping Pong in Washington, D.C. Only problem was there was no basement there. But that did not stop it being used by various media outlets to generate outrage, and eventually got connected back into the QAnon conspiracy, which led, unfortunately, to the January 6th event. So what's interesting here to me is not just the notion that these relationships exist and can be visualized, but that in many ways we see how Pizzagate leads to other kinds of events. So it's worth stopping here just for a second, and Michelle will chime in if there's any questions up to this point.
No questions quite yet.
So I've given you sort of some background and then some examples of what aren't visual criminology. So why, you might be asking, aren't what are very obvious visual examples of criminological phenomenon part of visual criminology? And the reason is that visual criminology has a very sort of critical orientation. It's really comes out of post-structuralist critique inspired by semiotics, but also visual cultural studies. And the idea here is that what an image purports to say is not necessarily what it actually means. And that part of the process of engaging with images is looking beyond the surface to what might else be going on. And that includes color, that includes form, that includes the way lines are constructed, details within the picture itself. But this idea that pictures are themselves accurate representations is problematic for visual criminology. And so you can immediately see the challenge, I guess, on two fronts. Folks like me who say, well, hold on, this is criminology and that's visual, and why is it that this shouldn't belong somehow within this broad rubric? Alongside others who say, well, no, the focus of visual criminology is critiquing and interrogating images, exploding the ways that media and images are used to try to control and shape our understanding of crime, justice, society, and norms. And that tension is an important part of understanding visual criminology, and it's one that we're going to come back to. The basic idea, visual criminology grows out of a number of sort of aspects, whether it's visual sociology or work by Howard Becker in the 60s, whether it's cultural and media studies and critique. But it's long been known within criminology circles that one of the reasons that the public is so afraid of crime and why that crime is such an effective political issue is that we are coded to care and we are easy to scare. And even though that rhymes, that was not my intention. The basic idea is that, and this has been documented, local news especially has created a business model by which it tries to terrify you about what was found in this toothpaste or why you shouldn't do this or that. And the biggest seller is crime. It's something we all care about, and it overinflates our understanding of crime in our own community. So this is another example of exploding, and this is my favorite. This is one of my favorite tools in the classroom, because I teach from time to time at Norwich University, which is a military college with students who are very sure that they want to be police officers and probation officers and are very dubious about the suggestion that systemic racism exists in any way. And at a certain point, we need to have that conversation so that we can sort of move on to other more pressing details within the study of criminology. But I show this image. Now, these are pictures and news articles from events just after Hurricane Katrina and the flooding. And I want you to read each one, and I want you to look at the pictures, and I want you to see if you can figure out what's going on here. A young Black man is called a looter after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday. Two white folks found bread and soda. They just found it in a local grocery store. They didn't loot it, they found it. This is some of the unconscious ways in which storytelling and photographs combine to really shape our understanding of race. And I want to come back to that a little bit because it's a really potent and powerful idea that a lot of the struggles that we have been basically, they're unconscious and they're part of things that we don't necessarily even recognize are happening. Just the language of looting and finders. Another example of this idea of challenging norms of contemporary society is this idea that we're being spied on with every click. We're giving up personal details. We've all had the experience now where we're looking for a new pair of shoes, and then all the ads that we see for the next 48 hours are a variety of new shoes or new socks to go with it. The idea now that people are pushing back against this, there's a visual element to this notion of critique and challenge. I'm not sure why I'm so drawn to this image. This comes from chapter 11, where we focus on, chapter 7, where we focus on the animating debates within criminal justice around crime and gender, crime and race, and the notion of sort of this popular punitiveness that's really infected our society in general, but certainly American criminal justice in particular. This is a visual activist who agreed to let me use this photo for the book, provided I make a donation to ACLU. His work really focuses on trying to explode in very obvious ways the juxtaposition between, well, in this case, obviously, the idea that we're not Nazis, we're just following orders. This comes from the early Trump era immigration policy, and ICE taking a lot of criticism, and the leader of the time saying it. There's the power of putting this on top of an ICE building as a means. He projects it. He finds a space where he can project it and not be detected, and uses that as a means to engage in activism and protest. Again, this is more consistent with a traditional notion of visual criminology, where there's some interplay, not only between the words, but between the central ideas. The art that emerged after the murder of George Floyd, how that animated the country. I don't know if we're just going to forget about it. But it really felt like there was a collective moment 18 months ago or so, where it felt like we're going to get serious finally about some of these unconscious stains around race and justice. And again, the way in which the visual plays out captures, I mean, there's so much going on in this photo, just alone. But the principal way in which the visual helps us to understand a particular moment in time, but also as a deeply corrective account of things that many people feel have gone wrong. This is an image that was created by an artist who's at Princeton right now. And he had created something else, and I really wanted to use it, and we weren't able to clear it. And so I just hired him to make another image. And what he does is he takes images that are in the public domain and he remixes them and combines them in new ways. And really what we're trying to get at is the idea of police as maintaining law and order versus provoking. And how almost without us being aware, our understanding of what the police do, what they should do, has shifted in very troubling ways. So that's one aspect of it, very criminological, very contentious and critical, and designed to try to explode sort of common ideas about the criminal justice system. But there's a whole other aspect to visual and cultural studies, which is really subversive. And the next series of images are from a group called Adbusters, which engages in a practice called what they call culture jamming. And it's about taking iconic images and flipping their meaning. And this is perhaps one example, but they've taken on a number of corporations in different ways, but they've also taken on this notion of the drug war. So again, the goal here is to take iconic images and then twist them around, subvert complicate, contest. Some are more effective than others, but there's an art to what they're trying to do. And I'm particularly interested in trying to understand the process that they use to create these images as part of a project I'm working on right now around cannabis. And Vermont, of course, has legalized possession, but we're still dealing with trying to set up retail markets. Basically, around the world, we're seeing efforts around decriminalization on the one hand, but the prohibitionist tendencies are strong. And this image is a fascinating story. I talked to the guy that made this because I really want to include it in the book. And he said I could, but he didn't want to be listed as the author. So this is a guy that has a small company creating ads. He's mostly web-based. And he did this as a joke, as a one-off. And he got so much hate mail because people thought it was serious. So people who are sort of against cannabis prohibition reached out to get upset with him. And once people realized it was a joke, then people reached out to get angry at him. Well, what's interesting about this is the way that it's constructed. So you see at the bottom left, the ad council. Cannabis prohibition has been a huge, problem for America, but it's also been perpetuated through public safety announcements and messages, through after-school specials, through stuff like the ad council. And some incredible work that's being done right now about trying to figure out how we can unlearn the problems with prohibition. But I would argue that this is part of visual criminology as traditionally understood. It's making fun of an officially sanctioned message, which that cannabis is horrible, and even one toke was going to result in murder. So where do I fit in all of this? Well, believe it or not, when I started thinking about visual criminology, I had no idea that these debates were debates. I didn't really know that it was a thing. I came at it from sort of selfish ends. I was working in Latvia, and I needed a way to try to understand what was happening among the participants of a project I was working on to develop the first probation service there. So Latvian, soon-to-be probation officers, and my trainers who were drawn from Canada, the US, the UK, and Norway. Well, we had translators, but not everything was getting through. And it became really clear to me that not everything was coming through. And so to try to understand, I turned to visual connections. And I began to see that what was being taught was not necessarily being learned. And we used some of that to help reshape the training program that we were under. And I worked with some incredible folks from across the country in Canada, and DC and other places. But by designing training programs to make sense of the situation that we were in, we were able to sort of be more successful in transferring concepts. And that turned into a dissertation where I tried to catalog visually what trainers were trying to do and what Latvians were understanding or picking up from the training. And I was able to do a couple of different rounds of data collection and compare them. And it turned into a variety of other things. But for a number of years, I was fascinated with collecting visual data from police officers and probation officers in the prison where I worked and other places, trying to get inside people's heads, trying to understand whether and to what extent their visual effort to outline their understanding was a match for how they thought about it. And one of the work that I was really intrigued by was this idea that the verbal only gets you so far, that we need to engage in some way in the visual to get at real meaning. So this image is sort of the result of 15 years of work. And as I say in the book, I was, as any good researcher will eventually acknowledge, a lot of the stuff that they thought they were figuring out for the first time has been done 20 or 30 years ago. But I was able to try and take previous stuff and organize it in a new way. And I just want to give you a few examples of what some of this visual data collection looks like. So concept maps come out of science education, a guy named Bob Novak, who published a paper in 1979, and they sort of took off. They're more formal. You sort of start with the big idea at the top, and then you work down, and you try to link major ideas and minor ideas. And in traditional concept maps, you actually make sentences, visual sentences, connecting key concepts. Because of how they're structured, they tend to lend themselves to more quantitative analysis, because concepts and linkages can be counted and scored and compared. That's very different from mind maps. Mind maps emerged in the UK from work from Tony Buzan. And I'm sorry for the resolution on this image, but I just really wanted to show you the color and the informality as compared to concept maps. So you have the idea in the middle, and then all of these sort of different tentacles or strands which sort of come out. And Buzan's big on this idea around color. He thinks that color helps us to connect to ideas in more profound ways. And you can even see there's little images there, and little drinks for parties, or little TV or radio. This is something that I came up with working in the medium security correctional facility in Eastern Washington. I was teaching philosophy at the time to folks incarcerated. And it was an AA program, Associates of Arts program, through Walla Walla Community College. And I became really interested in how people decided to better themselves behind bars. One of the big problems that we have is sort of coercive care, the idea that we can force people to do programming, we can force people to engage in things that we suspect is good for them, and somehow, if we do it long enough, they will eventually agree. I came at it from a slightly different point of view. I wanted people to tell me their education story. So I wanted to try to understand how their past influenced their future, but what are their memories from elementary school? What things did they like doing? And I will share that among the guys that I was working with, many of them had horrible education experiences. For them, learning was always associated with shame and failure. And one of the things that I'm most proud of that I was able to do in that program is create opportunities for people who worked really hard to get their GED and then started taking college courses. And over the period of 4 or 5 years, were able to graduate with an Associate of Arts degree before they were released. And I'm still in touch with some of those folks. We were able to graduate 150 students during the years that I was there, and the program has continued. I'm not suggesting that this visual map is in any way responsible, but I do think it's interesting thinking back about our journeys and even mapping and visualizing our journeys. So this is where we get this idea around visual criminology as data collection. And once again, this is not a traditional way to understand visual criminology. But luckily I met someone at a conference named Danielle Harris, who was also interested in this same problem. She was engaged in visual work. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what she tries to do here. This is what she calls a visual life history plot. These are for people who are in some form of care, whether it be the community or incarcerated. It tends to be folks who have a history of sexual offenses. And one of the things that she was really interested in is for people who are working with these folks, but who have massive caseloads and don't have time to read an entire file, was there a top sheet that would help remind them of who this person was by some of the sort of profound things that happened in their lives? And so she began developing this, what she calls the life history plot, which is based on earlier work around the life history calendar. But once again, it's autobiographical in the sense that people are interviewed and are encouraged to identify some of these key moments in their time, in their lives. And the process of generating these visual depictions often encourage some sort of reflection. So the question is, like, is there room for stuff like this? This mind map was of my mentor, Liz Elliott, who worked with me in Latvia and who introduced restorative justice to the country of Latvia and to the National Probation Service. And I mean, she was an absolutely incredible woman who's unfortunately no longer with us, but I think of the things that she taught me over the years, and I'm still in awe. But this is a reflection of her experience over a week training soon-to-be Latvian probation officers about trying to understand what restorative justice was. But you see it gets very personal. Watching Iraq War on TV, noting difference between reporting. She's talking about bowling, obviously a primary social gathering place. Why, she asks. Participants are clicking. Is there concrete learning, she asks? Circles, which is something she always insisted about starting and ending programs with. The discomfort of people trying to understand it. You see translator to the right here, where she asks, is the message coming across as intended? This, to me, became data. It became a way beyond simply asking questions. And of course, I engaged in numerous interviews with the folks that were part of this project, but this is their sort of unmediated reflection. All I asked was for them to draw me a map of their experience. And this is one example of what I got. This is from a project by Heath Copes, and Heath Copes is doing some of the most amazing work, I think, right now in criminology. He's really focused on trying to understand the lives of drug users in all the precarious permutations and considerations. And there's a lot of going on here in this photo, but he has a team with him. This photo is actually taken by a guy named Jared Ragland. And they have an incredible paper that's just come out that if you're interested in visual criminology and methamphetamine and what's it doing to the country, but also understanding in more profound ways the lives of the people who are caught up in this, their work is incredible. I included it because I want to make sure that as we're talking about visual criminology and data collection, we don't miss the power of photographs. And whether this tells us anything meaningful, I mean, I think of the anarchy or the swastika. I think of the way the drug-free zone is set up right outside a guy named Chico's house, who is well known as using drugs and selling drugs. To make sense of it. I think the challenge is, for all the reasons that I hopefully have convinced you of, using the visual in criminology, from thinking about problems and mapping out research plans to graphing data and diagramming policy implications. These things are already happening and they're already visual and their potential is clear. But Michelle Brown and Eamon Carabine remind us that the worry among many is that the potential for these images are going to be subverted and used by the criminal justice system and the state generally to continue to try to perpetuate certain messages. And I just loved how they said this, so I wanted to make sure we had it. Who use images as a means to control rather than enliven, to cage rather than free, and harm rather than console. And I think that's the question that's not easy to understand. I want criminology to embrace the visual. Folks who are working and identify as visual criminologists are deeply skeptical that we can do that without the visual serving state interests and not serving the more critical impulse that they harbor and they understand. So what are these problems? I mean, why are they so worried about it? It's useful thinking about that program Cops. Maybe some of you remember it, in the Bad Boys theme song. There's an incredible podcast called Running from Cops, which details the history of that program and the agreements under which it was able to proceed. But I can't shake this idea that for a generation of young people watching that show, they got a very simplistic idea of crime and justice. White people tended to be the cops or the good guys. Black and brown people tended to be the bad guys. There were a hero and a villain in every story. That program was syndicated and was played in numerous households in North America daily. I think that's influenced how we understand the criminal justice system. I also think that the decision to put suspected criminals in orange jumpsuits and parade them through perp walks is a fundamental challenge to this notion of innocent until proven guilty. In some ways, visually, we have already connected them with guilt, independent of what the ultimate trial or decision gets made. And the way that stigma works and the way that we internalize some of these things, I think is deeply problematic for this idea that due process rights exist and must be protected. I think if I were to summarize, and I would hate to summarize Professor Brown or Carabine's work, but this idea that the state will just use pretty graphs and charts to help justify and explain why it is we continue to punish as a first and de facto response to violations of norms within the criminal justice system. And that I think is their concern, and I think their concern is well-founded. But I also want to think about potential. The Wire did more to complicate our understanding of the drug war, the police, their use of surveillance technology, the unconscious way racism exists in America. That program did more over 5 seasons than most criminology professors will do over their lives. Storytelling counts. And if we are taking a broad view of what visual criminology is, especially as a critical effort to disentangle common assumptions, The Wire is required watching. But I would also say that there are ways to present data about the criminal justice system that help complicate some of our assumptions. And I want to show you an example of that in a second. The final one gets at our policy, the focus on policy and policy making. And the question is really to what extent researchers can communicate findings in ways that will allow policy decision makers and policymakers to latch on to make decent decisions. And I'll come to my point on that. But if folks are interested in criminology and criminal justice and they haven't seen The Wire, please get on that immediately. There's nothing There's nothing as good. The last class I taught at Norwich pre-pandemic was a course on The Wire. Yes, they paid me to watch The Wire with my students. And then we critically assessed criminological theories, criminal justice practices, and engaged with the material both as storytelling and art, but also as an indictment of the criminal justice system. In terms of representing realities, I came across this and I reached out to the author who's doing some interesting work. I guess if you were trying to understand systematic racism, it's useful to see these numbers together. And I would just direct your attention to the judiciary, where while white people represent only 63% of the population, they're 80% of state and federal judges. And I can't help but wonder when I look at police officers, and then I look at who gets shot by police, including unarmed people. It's the kind of thing which I guess you sort of know in the background, but seeing this information presented in this way, I think could help reach folks who might otherwise be suspicious of these claims. The last piece of this is based on a chapter from Professor Yu and George Burris. And they focus on what's called translational criminology. And the idea that one of the big challenges that we have is egghead criminological professors who are engaging in cutting edge research who present table 12.5 OLS regression models of incarceration length. And the presumption is that policymakers and elected officials are not only able to get elected and rise to positions of authority, but also happen to be statistical experts and can make sense of 2 stars versus 3 stars. I think that's false for a variety of reasons, but what they do is they show, using a number of examples, the difference between tables and visual approaches, like figure 5. So if you're trying to convey the reality that Black and white Americans are sentenced to different amounts of time based on the same crime and controlling for arrest history and criminal past, and you can immediately see one of the challenges with mass incarceration, one of the challenges as predicated by Michelle Alexander and her work sort of documenting systemic racism. So the potential for visual criminology to reach policymakers concludes this book. And it's fascinating to think about whether there is potential for visual translational criminology. But for me, the thing that matters most is that the visual might be an opportunity for us to re-engage our imagination. And what do I mean by that? This is a painting by a retired professor named Ronnie Lippens, taught for many years at University of Kiel in the United Kingdom, who's now retired. This painting it's essentially he tries to paint criminology. And he published an article said, can you paint it? Can you paint criminology? I don't know what this means. I have no idea. I can't tell you what the dot means or what the yellow or what the angles mean. But the fact that as part of his process to understand the discipline that he's been in for 50 years, that he takes to create art, I think is powerful and is important. And even if I don't understand it, I love that people are working in that area. This is a project by Julie Green in the University of Oregon. She did 1,000 plates. Each of those plates are renderings of a individual put to death in the US of their final meal. So 1,000 plates. Her project said that she would do 50 a year until she reached 1,000, or until the death penalty was until we moved on from the death penalty. And I think we all know how that went. She got to 1,000 before we got rid of the death penalty. I saw this in Washington, D.C. at a American Criminal Justice Sciences Academy conference. And it was so powerful to see the images of these last meals before the last thing that these people ate before they were put to death, the hands of the state. And to reflect on that, and the idea that this visual expression of this criminal justice issue, I think captures us in ways that might not be possible otherwise. I'll just speak for myself. It certainly captured me when I saw it. The final piece that I want to share is work from incarcerated artists at Eastern Washington. I'm still involved with an organization. It's called A Guiding Touch. A Touch of Light is the name of the organization. The picture on the left is a guiding light. The idea that art serves as a means for people who are incarcerated to express themselves, to find their way back to being human beings that are worthy of respect and hopefully eventually love, I think is profound. And I think this has to be part of visual criminology too. I think this work in which we engage visually with these questions is incredibly important. And if anybody's interested in looking at the work that A Touch of Light is doing, I encourage you to Google their website. I'd be happy to share their information. So I guess I end up convinced with my initial impulse, which was that despite the risks, it's important to expand the definition of visual criminology beyond critically engaging. That doesn't mean that we stop critically engaging. It doesn't mean that we don't encourage contesting and interrogating images that that some of us just accept sort of unconsciously. But it also means that we make room for the idea that we ought to visually plan our research, that we ought to take pen to paper and try to map out our thinking. That visual data collection might actually get us something that we wouldn't get otherwise. In my own work, the ability to combine visual diagrams of experience with follow-up interview questions really got at far more detail and nuance than otherwise was possible. In fact, I did a project where I talked to 20 people who had made a map and 20 people who didn't make a map. And just by logging the differences in their responses, folks who made a map dug a lot deeper and seemed to be able to reflect on their experience in more profound ways. Of course, analyzing images and interrogating depictions of crime is always going to be part of visual criminology. In fact, it might even be the most important part of it. But I worry that if we don't make room for the responsible presentation of information that can help guide criminal justice policymaking, we will condemn our discipline to be sitting along in the sidelines as the system continues to do harm to people in a variety of ways. And to the extent that visual explorations can help change that calculus, I think that that's a battle that's worth investing in. So I have to end with a pretty image. It's in my contract. Basically, that's everything I just said, but organized perhaps in a way that's easier to grab onto. I do see it as some sort of iterative process. I do think that the visual plays a role in a variety of different phases or cycles of a project. And I encourage you all in your work to take a moment and put pen to paper or chalk to chalkboard or get your coloring pencils out, and create art, whether it's to reflect on something or whether it's to try to make a decision. There is value in connecting visually. And it's something I don't know as adults that we do as much as we should. So I'd love to answer any questions that come up or entertain any comments. As I mentioned, I did leave a copy of the book at the Kellogg-Hubbard Library for folks who are interested, but I'm also available to answer questions offline or provide links to any of the images that you saw or that you're interested in. My email is there and I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to open it up. People should feel free to unmute themselves and ask a question, or you can put it in the chat and we can do it that way. People are always slow to be the first one. I'll ask you, Johannes, what are you working on right now? You muted yourself.
Thanks for reminding me. Yes, I am very close to submitting a manuscript on what we're calling cannabis criminology. And we're tracing the history of cannabis prohibition and really looking at different models for regulation. Obviously, that's of interest in Vermont because we're about to embark on sort of our own unique process. But what's fascinating is that a lot of the issues that come up through this topic are also relevant within cannabis, especially the way the media portrayed certain issues.
Yeah, I imagine that would be a large case, would be the images of how we come to the idea of how we think of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so trying to mirror those images, one of the questions that I've had is how do we engage this translational question, right? How do we engage decision makers and policymakers to share our research in ways that's going to make it easy to grab onto or sticky in some way? And the other big question is how do we create a constituency for reform when so many of us have particular ideas around cannabis and crime? And the challenge, so our neighbor to the north legalized cannabis in 2018. The challenge that they've had is that it really hasn't made a dent in the illicit market. The people who were buying from wherever they were buying from in the past just kept on doing that. And so stores cropped up, but they have not been able to match cost. It's far more expensive because of the variety of taxes that are leveled. And so the whole goal of trying to reduce the illicit market hasn't really succeeded. And so it's going to be interesting to see what Vermont does going forward. But the big challenge that we have are these prohibition myths. And many of these myths have seeped into our sort of collective unconscious through the media and through the depictions of cannabis and cannabis use.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Anyone else want to jump in with a question? I thought sometimes that there's a little bit of overlay, it seemed like, with art therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's something called a genogram that is used in psychotherapy, and it really involves again using the visual to help process past experience. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that particular examples came out of this publication, but in some of my previous work, I was really interested in trying to understand how different people were using that. what's fascinating about the visual is that people use it in so many different ways. And it almost ends up being, I don't know, unique or sui generis in the sense that people find ways to integrate it into their work. But you're certainly right. The use of art within therapy, even if it's just to create a mechanism for people to get emotion out, is certainly part of it and part of this discussion.
Yeah, it seemed like when you were talking about how you could access interviews, with more nuance, there was some of that going on.
Yeah, I had a friend at Simon Fraser University when I was sort of coming up with this, and I was trying to explain what I was trying to get at, because I wanted folks to make maps, and then I wanted to ask them a series of interview questions over a period of time. And what he said, what he likened it to, which it's always stuck with me, is like you're the pool cleaner with the pool skimmer, and each time you dip in, you get more and more stuff. But that for some reason, that visual exploration, I don't know, taps into something. It encourages people to reflect or remember things in slightly different ways. And again, part of my dissertation was trying to explain to a committee of somewhat skeptical criminologists that this was actually valuable. And I actually ended up doing this little mini project just to sort of prove. But the difference in the number of concepts and details that people remembered among the MAP group versus the non-MAP group, it was statistically significant. Like it wasn't a matter of like a little bit. It did seem to open the door, and I like that idea, and using it in other ways.
Yeah. And I like how you bring in the visual into every part of the process, not just, oh, we have somebody who wants, go ahead, Brooke.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking how this ties in with Gardner's theories of multiple intelligences, and also as a retired teacher myself, we know that you have to, in order to learn something, we all have different ways of learning and organizing information. And so this just ties in a lot of ways to learning theory, as well as all the things that you've talked about. I'm just, instead of just using words, either spoken or written, when your eyes sort of glaze over, finding something that presented a different way and uses a different method of bringing. And I thought the way you did those two charts, the one that was just sort of a lot of numbers and columns, and then the graph with the little swoops up on the one about how race affected the length of the sentence. That really, to me, was very, very very clear and explained what you were saying, made it really obvious. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Brooke. And I totally agree. I mean, I love the idea of one of the things that I've been doing is being a substitute teacher in my kids' elementary school here in East Montpelier, and it's been fascinating to see how teaching has changed in many ways from when I was a student, from what I can remember.
Oh, yeah.
But how some things have stayed the same, and encouraging students to brainstorm visually is such a core part of what so many teachers do. But for some reason, we just don't do it anymore. And as adults, we've sort of lost this, I don't know if it's ability or willingness or time or inclination toward sharing things visually. Just speaking for myself, when I get stuck with a concept, one of the things I need to do is try to graph it out or map it out, and somehow that does unlock, or at least help me identify what needs to be unlocked.
Well, this is kind of related to it. There is an author who writes a series of books about a character named Maisie Dobbs. who becomes sort of a female detective right after World War I in England. And one of the things Maisie does at the very beginning is she uses the back of wallpaper, as I recall, and she maps out what she knows. And as a reader of a lot of police procedurals, they do the same thing. They get these big whiteboards in and they start sticking up pictures and names and trying to tie things together. So that's a part of criminology that you didn't address, but you know, what do we know? What do we know about the different characters? Where's the holes in what we know? If you go to the puzzle solving part of fictional detective work.
What a wonderful way to put it. Yes, absolutely.
Linda, you've got your hand up.
Actually, it's actually David has his hand up here. Hi, Johannes.
Hi, David.
I'm curious. Yeah, this is interesting. I have your book, thank you, and I've started reading it. I've been a bit intimidated by it because I'm curious about how visual criminology relates to the sort of the body of criminology in terms of tendencies, of ways of looking at data, and my guess is that the visual is less accepted, perhaps. Is there bias against it? I guess it's a question because it's harder to quantify in terms of the looking at it statistically and significance, level of significance, and all that kind of stuff in terms of statistics. Is that in fact the case? I guess I've got a couple of questions in there, but
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I guess I would say that historically, the visual has been part of criminology, but it's been used in a very sort of representational way. And the assumption has been that what we display visually means the same to everybody. And visual criminologists come along based on visual sociologists and sort of cultural studies and say, well, hold on, that doesn't mean what you think it means. Or it, maybe it means what you think it means, but it means what you think it means because you're framing things a very specific way. And I want to call attention to the ways in which you're framing that. And so there is a contingent of criminologists who have adopted that view and are, again, come from the more critical perspective in terms of how they understand images and how images perpetuate cycles of control and domination. I think the question of to what extent is it's respected. I mentioned Heath Copes in part of my talk because he in some ways is bringing us back to the future, because his work using documentary photography to document and consider and interrogate the lives of drug users in America. His particular interest is in Alabama because that's where he's based. Is just providing this whole new sort of deep sense of understanding of an issue of a population that maybe doesn't get paid attention to, other than framed as a threat or a danger to themselves or others. And I think this idea of the visual being powerful enough to overcome our tendency toward make everything a number and then combine the numbers to try and derive meaning. They're on a different path. The ways in which the visual speaks to us, I think they say, would reach us in ways that numbers simply can't. And so to the extent that criminology can adopt that, I think for mainstream academic criminology, it really comes down to, can you present research findings in ways that decision makers can grab onto? And what that's going to mean probably is more visual graphs like the one I showed earlier, with all the different elements related to mass killings and different specific elements of within state law. And the question will be, can they design them in ways that are broadly reflective of their research, but also can reach people in a position to try and put that research into some sort of policy or practice. And I think that's very much an open question. But I think if you had asked me that question a couple of years ago, I probably would have been a little more pessimistic about the ability of the visual to make inroads within mainstream criminology. I think that opinion has to be revisited in light of this article and this group of people who are really trying to reclaim the visual element of criminology that was long part of it, but quite recently forgotten.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know I'm going to bring this to the library. We make a lot of decisions as a group, and we don't use visual elements very often. And I'm going to bring this to the library in the next thing we do. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And thanks for everyone who came and spent a little bit of time learning about visual criminology. I very much appreciate it. And please feel free to reach out if you have questions about the presentation or the work.
Thank you.